Alright, so I watched My Hero Academia Heroes Rising and I did not like it as much as Two Heroes. Don't get me wrong, it was enjoyable, but when compared to the quality of the rest of the My Hero series and even the first movie, there are a few glaring problems with it. So let's get right down to it. We start off with a chase scene of pro heroes going after the League of Villains, and the animation and action here are totally on point. The heroes get the job done, but all this really does is sets up the main villain for the story, this Raiden looking guy. The film takes place on the remote Naboo Island as part of a safety program, and already we have a problem. By now we've had the USJ incident and the Vanguard Action Squad invasion, you know, the one where Bakugo gets kidnapped by the League of Villains. These two incidents resulted in a plummet to UA High's reputation and led to public's distrust in the prestigious school. I find it very hard to believe that the school would agree to put the students unsupervised on a remote island far from any pro heroes.
While you're there, you'll be completely on your own. No teachers to help you or pros to back you up.
Yes, they do say that it's necessary to better train the next generation of heroes, especially with All Might's retirement, and that this is a good opportunity to make them self-reliant, but why were there no measures put in place of an emergency? This just seems like a very irresponsible move on UA's part. I don't think the island being remote and having a very low crime rate is an excuse to leave students unattended, especially after the incidents they've been through. I mean, look at the training camp arc. It was supposed to be a secret and there were even pro heroes present, yet they were attacked and one of their own students was kidnapped. So in what scenario did they think it would be a good idea to leave Class 1A, which already has a history of being attacked, alone on an island to train for hero work and without any emergency backup plan? If this film was canon, I am quite positive that this would have marked the end of UA High as we know it. It would become another instance of UA's incompetence to add to the rapidly growing list, and it's very likely it would have shut down, perhaps temporarily until they are able to convince the public that they are prepared for future incidents. This is the main reason I don't see this film as canon, because it makes zero sense for UA High to do this, and this would have had huge repercussions that would have significantly affected the main story. With that out of the way, let's focus on the good parts. I do like that they're actually learning how to be pro heroes by having their own hero agency. This is another example of how UA High has a good education program because their students actually get some form of experience to get them ready when they finish their time in the school. This is also a much better setup than the previous film, Two Heroes. In that film, Midori and All Might take a summer trip to I Island, but the rest of the students 1A just happen to be there as well. Each one with their own reasons, and even though they did provide an explanation of why they're there, it was rather forced. It would have made much more sense if this was just a class field trip set up by UA High. In Heroes Rising, the setup makes much more sense, with the exception of having no emergency plans in place. I like how immediately from the beginning, the students are already doing their job and using their quirks in real life situations. I also really like this improvised Deku transporter setup with gravity and earphone jack. The three of them look for a missing child, Katsuma, and they find him only to be scolded by his sister, reprimanding them for taking over an hour to find Katsuma. Before they leave, Katsuma thanks Deku, so already it's clear that Katsuma likes heroes and Mahoro doesn't. Now, I usually don't like bratty kids in fiction, and it still rings true here, at least in the beginning. As usual for the series, the characters do have proper motivations and are well established as characters. So what's Mahoro's deal? She's stubborn and spends her time messing with UA students by wasting their time. She makes an illusion of a giant mantis to screw with Bakugo, but he's quite astute and figures it out really quickly. Stuff happens, Deku stops Bakugo from committing child abuse, and we find out that Mahoro wants to dissuade her brother from becoming a pro hero. It's not that she hates heroes, but she's just looking out for her brother, which is actually good motivation. We've already seen this before, and are actually reminded of it in a flashback sequence with Deku's mom, so Mahoro's actions actually make sense. While all of this is going on, there's build-up for the second act. In the Kyushu region, Genji shows up and attacks and fondles Katsuma on Mahoro's dad's head to steal his quirk. And now there's a connection between these villains and the League of Villains. All for One. It seems like Cyborg has a version of All for One, and for some reason he's going around stealing quirks, and it has something to do with the pain he's experiencing when he starts controlling the weather to cause lightning to come crashing down. So the second act of the film is actually pretty good. The first major plot point occurs and Class 1A are now facing villains, and this time they cannot rely on pro heroes. The students prioritize saving the civilians and they do an excellent job at it. And this is what I like to see, heroes being heroes. We haven't yet seen 1A students actually do work saving civilians outside of the provisional licensing exam. And in superhero themed movies, I always love scenes where heroes actually do saving. The civilian saving isn't anything extravagant or flashy, it's pretty basic evacuation procedures, but they are handling the situation swiftly and without hesitation considering that they can't communicate via cell phones. We don't just see them saving civilians, they're also coordinating with each other while fighting the villains head on, which I think is really awesome to see. We already know and like these characters and have seen them grow since the start of the series, so it's pretty neat to see them have each other's backs. Now what do the villains want this time? They want Katsumo, who apparently has a similar quirk as his father. 9, the cyborg's name, needs his quirk because using his own quirk, weather manipulation, damages his body. Katsumo's father's quirk is cell activation, but it only works with type A blood, which he doesn't have. So he's gonna take Katsumo's quirk so Nai can use it on himself to do more villain stuff. But Deku shows up and just kidnaps them away. He tells them to run, which for some reason they couldn't earlier, and then Deku battles against 9 on his own. While all of this is going on, the students of 1A are also scattered in groups fighting the other villain. They defeat the mummy guy, but the team over at the beach are having problems defeating the wolf dude. And why are the bystanders just chilling in the background watching? These kids are risking themselves so that you can get the safety and you pay them back like this? Katsumo and Mahoro return to Deku when they see him getting his ass whooped, and there's this kinda emotional scene where Deku puts his life on the line to protect them, which he wouldn't have to at this very moment if the kids had actually run away. But it works out because Mahoro activates her hologram quirk to summon a giant, squash-looking version of Deku which alerts everyone else of their whereabouts. And I know this was supposed to be like an emotional moment, but I couldn't get over the fact how the hologram she produced looks so derpy. More stuff happens, Bakugo shows up to fight 9, but he also gets beaten to the ground. Deku and Bakugo refuse to give up though, but they're almost killed and the rest of Class 1A show up to rescue them and escape. I gotta admit, their escape was really well done, it didn't seem forced or anything. I like it when the story tries to give each character some contribution to the plot. I only wish characters like Tailman got some really cool action scene where he uses his quirk cleverly. Or even Invisible Girl. So anyway, Class 1A escapes, and this slows down the pacing of the story for a bit so the heroes can reconvene. The full motivation behind our villains are revealed, and it's not exactly anything new. They want to recreate the world where the truly powerful stand above everyone else. Wolfman joined him because he was treated horribly due to his appearance. We can only assume that the rest of them sympathizes with Nine's goals and that's why they're helping him. Nine offered his body for experiment to Dr. Eggman, who is helping All For One, which gave him a weaker version of All For One, and he wanted to use this quirk to reshape the world as he saw fit. Back on the hero side, they're stuck in a corner, figuratively speaking, which is always a good thing for writing an interesting plot. Writing yourself in a corner and then writing your way out of it makes for some really exciting stories. The civilians and heroes retreat to a warehouse where Class 1A have done a really good job setting up a soup kitchen style thingy for the villagers. We have Creati using her quirk to make essential needs such as toilet paper, and Charge Bolt is using his quirk to maintain power in the warehouse and keep the villagers comfortable. This film consistently does an excellent job of utilizing several of the students' quirks both in combat and non-combat situations, so I give the film points for that. They meet up and try to come up with a plan after Katsumo reveals to them that the villains are after his quirk, which he used to restore Deku and Bakugo back to commission. This is where Mahoro changes her views towards heroes and she sees them in a better light now. It would have been much more impactful if it hadn't already been done in the anime with Kota Izumi. Just a quick refresher. Kota hated heroes and didn't understand why they do the things they do. This all stemmed from his parents who were pro-heroes and they died on the front lines. Deku puts himself in harm's way and shows how far he's willing to go to save a kid he doesn't even know that well. It's kinda the same thing here. Mahoro is the kid who realizes that heroes are good after seeing the class of 1A dedicate themselves to the community of Nabu Island. At this point, I start to realize that the film really just borrowed a lot of things from the main series and doesn't introduce too many elements, but what it does borrow from the series, it does do a decent job at making the plot interesting. Our heroes come up with a plan now that they know what the villains want, and it's time for the final showdown. Deku and Bakugo are encouraged to work together as All Might's words ring through them, and this is kinda setting out my other big complaint of the film, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Deku comes up with a plan, making use of the island's terrain, and he even deduces Nine's weakness. This is well within character since we already know that Deku is really strong at analyzing and assessing quirks and situations. The final battle begins, and they manage to split up the villains. I think the anime rarely ever shows how destructive Can't Stop Twinkling's quirk can actually be, so I'm a fan of how his quirk is demonstrated to cause enough havoc to split up the villains alongside Creati's cannons. And I also really like how Cellophane and Uravity's quirks synergize so well together. We saw it during the provisional licensing exam and again here. So far, not much to criticize in terms of how the plan is being carried out. They even got one of the villains to fight Tsukiyomi in the cave, which as we all know powers up his Dark Shadow. And I like that. I like the action scenes here, and I like how the plan is going. The plan is well thought out, effective, yet not perfect enough to be something that a pro hero would come up with. I wanna say, this Chimera guy is intense. He's probably my favorite villain out of the ones in the film here, excluding the League of Villains of course. But let's also take a moment to appreciate how savage Todoroki is here. I honestly thought that he outright killed him. Now, humans have survived being frozen, so I can understand Chimera surviving that move considering how his constitution definitely surpasses that of a human's. But still, that attack just looked so brutal, especially with the ice pillars that shot out his mouth, that I thought Todoroki just committed murder. And let's move on to Tsukiyomi here. I've said before that a number of things that happened in the film were basically just callbacks to things that happened in the anime series. Tsukiyomi getting enraged when he saw Pinky get hurt is pretty blatant. At this point, I realized that the film is really just fan service. That's not a bad thing, fan service is great when done well. Having references to iconic moments in the anime isn't a downside in my opinion, I just wanted to make that observation. Back to the situation with 9, Bakugo admits he's a masochist.
Yeah, I guess you should have hit me harder.
And Deku comes to fight with him, and honestly their coordination is actually pretty impressive considering how Bakugo usually prefers to do things for himself. It just shows how even though Bakugo has a lot of pride in him, he knows that the current situation they're in is dire and that he'll have to work together with Deku in order to triumph. It's showing how he's progressed as a character and has acknowledged Deku's strength. So just as they both seem to put 9 at his limit, he injects himself with steroids and he gets superpowered, and then we cut back to the mainland, where Hawks is investigating what happened to Maharu's father, and then finds out the villains are there at Nabu Island. It could have been removed from the film and nothing would have changed. I suppose its purpose is to let the audience know that the pro heroes are now aware of the situation and are now coming to the rescue, but we were already shown Crady making a drone to send a message to them, so we already assumed that the heroes would eventually show up.
Heartbeat distortion!
Man, I love Jiro. I honestly think she's such an underrated character. 9 manages to break through the rest of Class 1A, and we get some nice child abuse and hostage taking. I actually really like how the film isn't afraid to show children getting hurt, and it really shows how desperate 9 is to acquire Cosmo's quirk. So stuff happens, Deku and Bakugo intervene, and the final battle ensues. They get their asses handed to them, and comes the biggest issue I have with the film. In order to defeat 9, who is basically like a mini-boss version of All For One, Deku decides to pass One For All to Bakugo. While doing so would mean that Deku would eventually lose his quirk, they can double up on 9 with both of them using One For All, essentially giving them the much needed boost to defeat him. This is pretty much fan service, and not in the way that's good in my opinion, since it felt really forced. We've already established that One For All could have a will of its own, like that time when we saw One For All save Deku during his fight against Shinso, so the explanation that One For All wanted to stay with Deku has grounds, but my main issue here is the power transfer itself. We know that Bakugo needed to consume Deku's DNA in order to inherit One For All, and while we don't actually see Bakugo eating any part of Deku, that's exclusive to Rule 34 artists, others have made the argument that since they were both wounded, Bakugo and Deku's blood kinda mixed together and entered Bakugo's body, so there's the basis for the DNA transfer. But in the anime, All Might explicitly stated that it takes time for One For All to transfer to Deku, and it's also quite hard to believe that Bakugo not only could use One For All immediately after the transfer, but also use it at 100% right away. I know Bakugo is a top student and he would definitely be quick on picking up and learning how to use One For All, but the events that played out in the final fight contradicts the already established rules of One For All. That, mixed in with the less than clear circumstances surrounding the transfer that I mentioned before, ultimately makes this writing decision a cop-out that is a cheap attempt at pulling at our heartstrings. But I know that many fans were likely cheering on seeing Bakugo and Deku using One For All together, and I admit the imagery was amazing to see if I ignore the context of how we got there. But it didn't take me any time at all to question the consistency of the events that played out. I don't know, maybe I'm being overly picky, but the One For All transfer and the weak explanation behind Deku still keeping it didn't feel satisfying to me. To be honest, UA being irresponsible is a bigger issue here, but the fact that both my biggest problems in the film occurs at the beginning and ending really hurts the impact it had on me. Don't get me wrong, I'd still tell My Hero fans to watch it if they haven't already. It's definitely not a waste of time since a lot of characters are utilized properly, but My Hero Academia Heroes Rising could have done with a better setup and ending. So I will give this film 7 out of 10.